Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me okay. My name is Paqui Paredes. I'm the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Western Washington University. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to our fall CHSS Dean's Lecture Series. Although it's not the first time that CHSS sponsors a talk in this online format, it is in fact the first time that the Dean's Lecture Series is held on as a Zoom webinar. This is a series that is typically held at City Council. It's co-sponsored by the City of Bellingham and recorded and broadcasted by our local TV station. However, due to COVID-19, we are changing the format quite substantially. And I see that we actually have a lot more attendees than it's typical. And I see a lot of both known and unknown names on the list of attendees. So thank you all for getting together virtually with us for this event. Some of you might be regulars in this series and some of you are probably new. This series was initiated with a desire to give back to our community. Our intention is to showcase the different ways in which the study of the humanities and the social sciences, and particularly the scholarly work and the research that is undertaken by the faculty in the college, can help us better understand the world we live in. Its past and its present, and help us find solutions to the challenges and problems that our world and our society face. And today's lecture is a perfect example of this. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Carolyn Nielsen, a professor in the Department of Journalism here at Western. Carolyn worked as a newspaper reporter and editor for more than a decade and has taught at Western since 2004. She teaches news writing, reporting, advanced reporting, ethics, a research seminar, and a course called Diversity, Mass Media, and Social Change. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and a master's in journalism from Northwestern University. She also holds a PhD in communication from the University of Washington. Her research focuses on the intersection of newsroom sociology, technology, and coverage of race and immigration. Her book, Reporting on Race in a Digital Era, was published by Palgrave Macmillan earlier this year. So it's a pleasure to introduce Carolyn. Before she comes in, just a few housekeeping items. We will reserve all questions to the end of the talk. I want to thank you all who have submitted questions ahead of time. You will also be able to submit questions during the talk using the chat function. After the presentation, Dr. Nielsen will come in and she will answer a selection of those questions. We have received a lot of questions and we know we probably won't be able to get to all of them. I want to thank Dr. Mark Geisler, Associate Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, for facilitating the question and answer portion of this event. Finally, I also want to thank Susanna Glatz, Administration Assistant of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, as well as Janine Bengstrom, the Director of Alumni and Constituent Relations, for all the work they have done to make this event possible and a success. And with that, my introductions are over. I wish very much that you enjoy Dr. Carolyn Nielsen's talk.
Good afternoon. I'm Carolyn Nielsen in the Western Washington University Department of Journalism. Thanks very much for joining me today for this conversation. I'd also like to thank the Western Washington University College of Humanities and Social Sciences, particularly Dean Paqui Paredes, for inviting me to give this talk, and also the Western Washington University Alumni Association for being part of this process. I'm speaking to you today from my home in Bellingham, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we gather today on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin, throughout the San Juan Islands, and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. Whenever I talk about my research, I like to talk a little bit about how I became interested in doing this work that spanned 5 years worth of research. I never learned about diversity or issues of inclusion in either my undergrad or my graduate work in journalism. I never had a meaningful training or conversation about these important issues in the more than a decade I spent in newsrooms, including newsrooms in Southern California, in which I covered very racially diverse populations. And so in the summer of 2014, when Michael Brown Jr. was shot and killed by a white police officer, and his body was left in the street in Ferguson, Missouri in the summer heat for over 5 hours, I was really watching this national coverage. And I started to notice things that just seemed very different to me from other stories I had seen. For one, journalists were starting to talk to people in the neighborhood, people who knew Michael Brown Jr., people who had been nearby when this happened, people who were also expressing that they had been racially profiled or harassed by Ferguson police officers. Journalists were starting to retweet eyewitness accounts and witnessing of things. They were starting to give a new kind of credibility that I hadn't seen before to people who were not official sources like mayors or police chiefs or business owners, and really listening more to the community. And that struck me as different in a really good and promising way for better journalism. But I wanted to make sure it wasn't just an impression. So I started doing this research. I was curious about whether things were really different, and if so, why? What was facilitating this shift? And I had some hypotheses. Some of them bore out, some of them didn't. So I'd like to share a little bit with you about my journey. What I'm talking about today is really a small slice of a much larger research project that culminated in my book, Reporting on Race in a Digital Era, which was published in March. It's also available to you as an ebook through the Western Library. And I've asked the Bellingham Public Library if they would also get a copy so that it can be more widely accessible. So my research examined 8 years worth of news coverage of racial issues. And I also spent many hours conducting in-depth interviews with journalists who cover racial issues, particularly those who had covered Ferguson. And I really feel it's important to share their insights. So I'm gonna try and make some time to share some of those audio clips at the end of my presentation. Today, I'm really going to talk about a little bit about where journalism has been, where it's going, kind of what's shifting, and what's in the way of that progress. So let's go back to 2014. In 2014, we had this major national attention to what would have otherwise been a very tragic and also locally covered story. Yet, every year, the Associated Press takes a national poll of newsroom reporters, broadcast managers, all kinds of journalists across the US, and they vote on what they think the most important stories of 2014 were, and the AP produces this top 10 list every year. So I looked at that when it came out and was frankly surprised to see police killing of African Americans as the top story of 2014. The poll specifically named Michael Brown Jr. and Eric Garner, who had been killed shortly before in New York City. What was interesting about this to me is that Michael Brown Jr. was actually the 16th, at least the 16th, Black person killed in an encounter with police in 2014. He wasn't the first, he wasn't the 100th, he was the 16th. So by news standards, this really wasn't new. It was tragic, yes, but it had also happened many times before in many different places. So why Ferguson? What we noticed was that in 2014, journalists started connecting these incidents together. They started connecting these violent encounters that often resulted in deaths and seeing them as part of a larger system. And I really wanted to explore more deeply what was facilitating that change. We saw that racial violence again, made the top 10 poll in 2015 and 2016. And this was really interesting because I looked back at 25 years worth of AP polls of top 10 stories. And in the previous 25 years prior to 2014, no story about racial violence had ever made the top 10 list. So we can see that there was definitely a change going on there. So the US news media, mainstream news media, has just a terrible and well-documented history of ignoring and racial violence, misrepresenting racial tensions. And I mean, it dates back it's as old as the US news media itself. In about 1825, the Black press started developing in the South, and it really started to grow around the time of the Civil War, and it hit its peak in the 1920s. The Black press still exists today, although it's much smaller than it once was. But the Black press really came about to speak to issues that were being ignored and misrepresented in the mainstream or white news media. And one of the key figures here is, of course, Ida B. Wells, who was a suffragist as well as a journalist and who lived through a lot, to say the least. Her press was burned down, and so she moved north and she took on the New York Times. And she really felt that if she could just convince the white mainstream news media to accurately cover lynchings and racial violence, that the people, the masses, the white people reading those publications would rise up and put a stop to those things. And as we know, that didn't exactly happen that way. But Ida B. Wells was one of the first to really call early attention to the ways that the mainstream media was misrepresenting things that were happening to Black folks. So it wasn't really until 1968 with the Kerner Commission that a standard, kind of an official standard, was set for how US news should cover racial issues. We'll remember that the Kerner Commission was launched by Lyndon Baines Johnson in response to trying to figure out what had fueled mass unrest and uprisings in cities across the nation in the summer of 1967. And the Kerner Commission report is pretty thick. You can read the whole thing online. I'd encourage you to do so. It's pretty interesting. There's a whole chapter that's devoted just to journalism. Imagine this whole chapter in this document about what fueled racial unrest. There's a whole chapter about journalism as part of the problem. And the Kerner Commission actually allocated quite a bit of resources to doing this work. They sent out sociologists into the neighborhoods that had been covered, and they talked to folks and said, hey, does this coverage represent what you saw? And people, of course, said no. And, we've been villainized, we've been stereotyped as aggressive and violent, and this doesn't represent anything that the points we were trying to make with our civil action. So Kerner said, hey, journalism, you play a really important role in folks understanding race relations. So you really need to do a better job. And we think the one thing you should start out by doing is hiring more journalists who are people of color. And we think that's really going to help things. So at the time, about 5% of journalists were people of color. A few years later, in 1973, the Association of American Society of News Editors, sorry about that, came up with a parody project. And what they said was, we want newsrooms to reflect the communities they serve. Newsroom demographics should look like the community demographics. And we think this can happen by 2020. A couple of things happened. Newsrooms became less diverse and the population became increasingly more diverse. And so the parity gap actually grew. We saw that in 1999, the year before they were supposed to have achieved this milestone, there was, for the first time in 23 years, a decrease in racial diversity in newsrooms. In 2019, the most recent data available, newsrooms are about 21.9% journalists of color, and the US population as a whole is about 40%. So we will keep watching till 2025, but that gap is not getting smaller. The problem is that regardless how diverse newsrooms are, they are still institutions that produce coverage in patterned ways. And a lot of people think this is subjective. So here's a study of something that is really not subjective. Two researchers took they analyzed footage of Los Angeles news coverage, of TV news coverage of homicides, and they compared that with the police data. And what they found was that white people were grossly overrepresented as homicide victims. African Americans were grossly overrepresented as perpetrators of crime. And Latinx people were pretty much missing, where their homicides were just not reported on. So this was in 2000. So these are not really subjective measures. They're things that have been verified through dozens of studies over a very long period of time. When I'm talking about journalism as an institution, I mean that in the sense that anything is an institution, right? Healthcare is an institution, education is an institution, criminal justice is an institution, and institutions have their kind of unspoken rules and norms. In journalism, there are three that I have kind of identified to talk about today that are really problematic and in the way of progress. The first one is the news media's value on objectivity. And I always have to use the air quotes for that because it's not a thing. News media's reliance on elite sources versus people who are actually living the issue. And then journalists really believing that they should be the folks deciding what you need to know, right? Setting that news agenda. We will tell the people what they need to know. That is really, those are three strong tenets of traditional journalism that have been around for a really long time and continue to really set newsroom culture. So the first one of these, this idea about objectivity, it's very outdated. It was originally in the 1926 Code of Ethics where it said, yes, don't have any bias, which we're human beings, so we know that's not possible to not have bias. And then in 1973, they said, well, we get that some of you might have bias, but really, if you want to be a really good journalist, you can achieve this. This is something achievable to not have bias, which, again, not true, right? And then in 1996, the most recent reiteration of the Code of Ethics, they've just said, okay, we get it. We all have bias, but like, try not to stereotype people. Which is it's a little bit of a nod to this more, this idea that we can't be 100% unbiased. Yet, even though the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics says this, we find that practitioners aren't really talking about objectivity in that way. And we'll talk about that more a bit. So, I want to talk now about technology. This is the second thing that has changed. So we talk about this potential, this hypothesis that we have observed a change in journalism. What else is happening at the same time? Well, there's a huge shift in technology, right? That really has this potential to disrupt these long-held journalism norms. So technology does a couple of things for journalists, and it does some things for the audience too. And I think it's important to understand those in relationship. So this new digital technology allows for born digital news startups to enter the field, like BuzzFeed, Politico, Mashable, Vox, Axios, right? All of these new born digital news outlets that are coming online. And you wonder, like, are they also valuing these same traditional norms or not? We also see that technology has allowed for news organizations devoted specifically to coverage of racial issues. Two of them we're going to talk about today, NPR's Code Switch and ESPN's The Undefeated. And these are kind of like a digital revitalization of the old race beat reporters that we had in the late 1960s and early 1970s, right? A revival of the race beat. So their new digital technologies are allowing for journalism to function in new ways. They are also allowing for the audience to function in new ways, right? We've seen an end to the digital divide, at least racially, in terms of smartphones. And also we're noticing that this 18 to 24-year-old audience, which is the most coveted news audience and the most difficult to reach, they're using their smartphones to look at news and share public affairs. And this is one of the top 3 things they're doing with their phones. So a really increased level of consumption. That's exciting, right? Also, these audiences are using social media to gather around topics that maybe the news media isn't reporting on. And that's creating what we call forced conversations. One of these that I examine in my book is a hashtag that emerged after the death of Michael Brown Jr. Many news organizations were showing his cap and gown photo that you saw at the beginning of this slideshow. Other news organizations were showing a photo that some people thought made it look like he was throwing a gang sign. He wasn't, but that's what they thought. And he, had kind of a not happy look on his face. And the photo made you think he was perhaps a certain way. And people didn't like it, particularly African-American people didn't like it. And they took to Twitter, and within 24 hours of the first hashtag If They Gun Me Down post, 100,000 people had participated in this hashtag, really calling the news media to account for its choices regarding images to portray Michael Brown Jr. As you can see in this example here, these 2 photos are of the same person saying, "This is me, this is also me. If police killed me, how would the news media represent me?" And again, this took place only on Twitter. Not very many news organizations chose to report on it, but a couple did. But the conversation took place with or without the news media participating. So the questions I looked at with my research were whether coverage shifted and what's the deal with this new technology. For the first one, I decided to go back to a key inflection point, contemporary racial inflection point, which was the 2007 nomination by the Democratic Party of Barack Obama to be a presidential candidate. It was really an interesting thing to go back and read that coverage from 2007, because we know scholars who have studied this have said that this term post-racial appeared in only 12 headlines or first sentences of news articles between 1990 and 2007. But then in 2008, it appeared in news coverage 226 times in 1 year. Coincidence? I don't think so. So all of a sudden, we've got this post-racial question, right? We have a Black man running for president of the United States. Are we now post-racial? Through to, we have a Black president. Are we now post-racial, right? And news coverage was really treating this as a serious question. So I looked at that, coverage of that moment. And then I looked at the birth and growth of the Black Lives Matter movement, which began with the acquittal of the man who killed Trayvon Martin in 2012. And then I looked at coverage of Michael Brown Jr.'s death up until the March 2015 Department of Justice report that was really a scathing indictment of systemic racism within the Ferguson Police Department. So I looked at this coverage over all of these 3 key moments for from 2007 to 2015. And I wanted to look at them in some different places, right? I wanted to define journalism more broadly than the New York Times, because frankly, that's what the journalism landscape looks like these days. So I did include the New York Times and the Washington Post as examples of what scholars call a representative liberal or traditional journalism. It values very arm's length, I'm detached, I'm neutral, I'm going to talk to a lot of elite sources and tell you what happened, and you will pay attention, and then we will move on to the next story. And that's compared to these new digital paradigms. There are 2 new digital paradigms I looked at. The first one I mentioned earlier, it's called the interactive race beat. It's a revival of that race beat from the 60s and 70s. But this one is digitally enabled, and it uses social media to open this kind of wider conversation about the topics of the day. It intentionally seeks out a wide variety of stakeholders and tries to build understanding about an issue. So kind of a gathering point. Hey, these are the issues of the day. What does everybody think about this? The last one, Whitaker calls journalism 3.0, and it's really interesting. Think about BuzzFeed. It's characterized by blending kind of high and low culture, and it leverages social media to kind of listen in and decide what to cover. Hey, what are the folks talking about? We'll cover that, which is really a sea change from we will tell you what you need to know, right? That's very different approach. It also seeks to elevate the voices of the oppressed, people who are living the issue, people who are living racism rather than talking about it in the abstract, and to tell readers how they can participate in a democratic way. So that's another key feature. It seeks to really hold this conversation open. Like, let's keep talking about this, and this is how we build a better and more just world. So this is, again, a very condensed bit of my work. But what we see is that the two new paradigms offered really different coverage. And also what we see is during and after Ferguson, traditional journalism took a real turn. It did change. It moved in very unexpected ways. For one, the post-racial question disappeared. That's probably not so surprising. But number two, traditional news outlets began to call out racism, which is something that is brand new. We haven't seen that in previous journalism studies. We began to see, we as readers, I as a researcher, began to notice the increased number of people who were sources talking about their pain, their fear, their lived experiences with racism versus police chiefs and governors, right? And really, this is really key, and this is, I think, important to the future. News coverage began to look at racism more in terms of a systemic problem and less in terms of disparate murders that had happened across the country or acts of violence that had happened across the country. They began to say, hey, I think this is a symptom of a larger problem with our criminal justice system. These aren't just a bunch of bad apples here and there. There's something more insidious and something deeper going on. That was definitely a first. And then finally, the coverage actually began to recognize the Black Lives Matter movement as something with political power. When the movement began in 2012, it was largely characterized as, you know, a slogan on Twitter. And then at the beginning of Ferguson, it was like, okay, there's a bunch of loud young people in the street. You know, what are they doing? And then toward the end, 2015 and on, the coverage really looked at the Black Lives Matter movement as a force in the 2016 presidential election. So we really saw a change there in the way the protest movement was covered, and that was pretty interesting. As I acknowledged, my research stopped in the middle of 2015. I'm eager to get back in and look at things that happened this summer, particularly the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and how those were covered, and if they represent this trend. I think that's something we can do all the time as readers, informed readers, look at sourcing, look at examples of whether this portrays racism systemically or whether it's portraying this as an isolated incident. So those are things we all can do as news consumers. A couple of other changes have happened in the field that I wanted to point out. In 2019, the Associated Press Style Book, which is the field's key guide on language use, finally said, hey, stop using things like racially insensitive. Just if it's racist, call it racist. And I was pleased to see that because in the in-depth interviews I did with journalists, this was the #1 thing they called out as a problem with journalism. Like this, is it racist? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Maybe it's racially adjacent, right? They just wanted journalists to call things racist. In a subsequent study I've done over the summer of coverage of Ilhan Omar, we have seen that when the president tweeted at her to go back, news coverage just said, yep, that's racist. So that was surprising and interesting change to see. In July 2012, Carissa Thompson, who's one of the journalists I interviewed for my book, also someone who covered Ferguson, was named managing editor for diversity and inclusion at the Washington Post. She is the first Black woman to hold that level of leadership at the Washington Post. So that's a change. And then just last month, the Society of Professional Journalists launched a hotline for reporters who have questions about race and gender to call and get help on deadline. Really hope journalists will do that. I think it's a great resource, and then it's an acknowledgement that is needed. Like, we need to do better. Let's help each other. But still, there are also some challenges to this progress, right? Here's some that remain. Elite voices are still dominating sourcing. News media is still really having trouble focusing on intersectionality. And intersectionality, if you're unfamiliar with the term, refers to the multiple ways that people can be marginalized based on aspects of their identity. For example, Carissa Thompson, who was in the previous slide, would face bias because she's Black and bias because she is a woman, right? So she faces intersectional bias. News media is still not doing a very good job acknowledging that people have identities that don't fit in tidy boxes. That's an area of growth. There is still an excessive focus, particularly on TV news. We saw this with the George Floyd protests over the summer. There's still this focus on property damage versus why people are in the streets. I wish I could answer why that was or when that would stop. It'd be a great next area of research. And then finally, 2020 opened this, what I find was kind of a strange new conversation about whether journalists had lost sight of objectivity, like we were supposed to go back to some golden era of objectivity, which, I mean, that's not a thing. That doesn't exist. And what troubles me is that this kind of call for objectivity has come at the same time when many journalists of color have started complaining about the way their newsrooms, justly raising concerns about their way their newsrooms are covering racial issues. And it's like, well, you're not being objective, and we're worried about that now. It's troubling to me, and so it's something I want to explore a little bit more. So this is Wesley Lowry, formerly of the Washington Post, who is actually one of the reporters who got into trouble and eventually left the Washington Post after Marty Baron was angry with him for tweeting that coverage of the Tea Party really should mention that it was racist. I want to play for you a little bit of audio from my interview with Wes Lowry, who's now at CBS, so that you can hear him talk about objectivity.
What is your view of the role of objectivity in the type of journalism that you do?
So I don't believe in objectivity. I don't think it exists. I think that I believe that my job is to be fair. And I think what aids me in being fair is beginning by understanding and accepting the reality that I'm not objective. Mm-hmm. And so when I accept that and I understand that and I can articulate the ways in which I am not objective, it then allows me to interrogate those things and to make sure that I am checking myself and very actively, very actively interrogating my own potential biases. I mean, the biggest lie the American media has ever told itself is that such a thing exists as some type of media objectivity, right? Mm-hmm. Then any story we write, there's a series of subjective decisions being made by people based on their biases before the story is even written. The first subjective decision of those being, is this a story worth covering or not? That is a subjective decision. There is not an objective list of these things are worth covering and these things are not, right? That is based on the opinions, the biases, the desires, the interest of a set of random editors somewhere. And what we know, based on all the available data, is that those editors do not reflect the diversity and nuances of our nation, and rather are a bunch of like white dudes, right? and so because of that, I think we just have to disabuse ourselves of this idea that our media has ever, abided by some type of strict objectivity. Our media coverage has always relied on a bunch of subjective decisions. And I think that once we understand that, we can start to undo that, and we can start to think, how might we cover something in a way that's more fair? How might we cover something in a way that's more measured? In my coverage, I think my job is to be fair. I think that requires a lot of reporting. It requires a lot of asking questions. It requires trying not to make assumptions, doing that extra interview, making that extra call. But I think but I also think it's my job to be willing to say things that are difficult for some people to hear. And I think that I don't think that we have a history in American media, especially mainstream American media, of valuing the views and experiences of people of color. And so I think it can be very shocking for a white reader to all of a sudden encounter coverage that does that. Mm-hmm. I think that, what do you mean that you're taking these protesters seriously? That's very confusing to people. They're not used to media that somehow acknowledges the humanity of people of color and the agency of them, right?
So I think what Wesley Lowry said is reflective of what many of the journalists I interviewed said. Gene Demby of NPR added that objectivity centers whiteness, which is something Wesley Lowry alludes to. But Gene Demby says it very strongly about how objectivity centers whiteness as the natural order of things. That's a very strong statement, and one he didn't have trouble backing up. I think it's really important to talk about and explore the ways in which these messages are continuing to center whiteness in a way that hails all the way back to what Ida B. Wells was talking about. I'd like to talk about how journalism can better serve democracy, and I'd like for you to hear the ideas of Soraya McDonald, who had some great things to say about this. She was also someone I interviewed for my book. She talked about what newsrooms need to do. I also want to talk about what journalism education needs to do, which is it needs to attend centrally to the issues of diversity, equity, and justice, and really acknowledge that they are an area of expertise. This is what Soraya McDonald has to say about that in the newsroom.
I think for mainstream news organizations as a whole, I think they have to do two things. One is, like, they can't continue with having like these newsrooms that are so enormously homogenous, because it just, like, they just don't reflect the communities that they're covering. Like, that should be a huge sort of credibility issue and crisis that should really be bothering people. But the other thing that I think is really important is that, like, this is not an easy fix. And covering race, I think, is just like covering anything else, in that you have to work at it. I think a lot of these organizations sort of mistakenly feel like, okay, well, we can just hire these people, and then they'll just be themselves, and somehow, like, it'll just sort of like eke out into the coverage. And then it basically, you end up like hiring people of color with the expectation that they will be the ones who will do sort of all the reporting and writing and heavy lifting about race. But just like, if you are going to send me to cover the war in Afghanistan, then, you know, I have to read a bunch of stuff to become knowledgeable about that.
Right.
About Afghani culture and about military culture and all, you know, like, everything that informs like what is going on in the war in Afghanistan. So if you're going to cover race, it doesn't matter like who you are. You still have to do the work.
Right.
You still have to like talk to experts and report and read things, and have like a level of curiosity. And that's like what's going to make it good. And like, that's just a standard expectation for a reporter, no matter what they're covering.
I think what we see in both Soraya McDonald and Wesley Lowry's comments, also Jean Denby and others, is they're really talking about things that they're widely accepted as important tenets of just doing good journalism. So also journalists acknowledging their inherent bias and newsrooms valuing the lived experience of people with marginalized identities. That's really important. We cannot ask people to suppress their identities. And we shouldn't. There is value to that lived experience and bringing that lived experience to the reporting process. That's kind of a radical thing to say in journalism, but there you go, I said it. It's important. We also need to have ongoing newsroom discussions about how to cover racial issues, diversity, particularly in newsroom leadership, which is still very, very white and male. And then resources to just constantly be learning more, as Soraya McDonald said. I want to thank you very much for attending today's talk. I'm looking forward to your questions. Please feel free to email me. Here's my email address. I'm really open to talking with folks. And thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, my name is Mark Geisler, and I'm Associate Dean in the college. And we've received questions submitted previously, and I'm going to start with those. And then we, of course, invite live questions. I see we already have one, and I'm going to layer those in as well. Please go ahead and submit them to the Q&A, which you can find right at the bottom of your screen. So the first question we have is for Carolyn is, so far the digital era has led to a widespread distrust of authentic sources and excessive propagation of disinformation. How can we reverse this trend? So Carolyn, you need to unmute.
Sorry. That is a great question. And I like questions like this because they are yes and questions. What we see is that the digital era has allowed new voices into the conversation. It has allowed new people to set the news agenda, what we even read or think or talk about. It has allowed a counter narrative to push back against decades old systems of really poor news coverage of communities of people of color. It's allowed for a new type of witnessing, right? When we see someone at a protest publishing or tweeting live footage from an event where they are, and then maybe we even see news reporters retweeting that, kind of giving it some more, I guess, gravitas once they've verified it. It's allowed for a way for people to hold journalists and journalism accountable. And so I don't think we can reverse it, even if we want to, but I personally don't want to. I think what we need to do is adapt to it. And I think, authentic sources, we're probably talking about those traditional news sources that have historically not been doing such a fantastic job and have been forever mistrusted by Black and Brown communities. So I don't want to return to that, nor do I think we should. It is true also that there is declining trust in journalism. It is true that there is declining trust in journalists, and that is unfortunate. But I think it's the price we pay for allowing a more democratic conversation, and I think it calls on all of us to become more critical consumers.
Thank you, Carolyn. We'll go on to our second question. What resources or reference works are available for editors to use to prevent reinforcing racial or other stereotypes?
Great question. There's a brand new one that I really want to put out there. The Society of Professional Journalists last month, in conjunction with a new organization for trans journalists, has launched a hotline for reporters on deadline. It's free and it's confidential, editors too, journalists on deadline. It's free and it's confidential, and you can call them and say, I'm really struggling with this issue or this language. Can you help me so that I don't do it wrong? And I'm hoping, I mean, I worked in a newsroom for a long time, and so I think maybe anyone else who has might also accept the fact that journalists aren't always great at admitting what they don't know. And so I think that's my fear, is that people will be so afraid to admit they don't know that they might not use the deadline or the hotline. But I will repeat something that my journalism mentor, the late great Herb Cam, taught me back as an undergrad, which was, it's better to look dumb to one person than to thousands of people. So I really hope that folks will use that. In addition, there are some resources that aren't specifically for, well, and also of course the SPJ Diversity Toolbox, and then many journalism organizations have their own style guides, such as the National Association of Black Journalists, National Association of Hispanic Journalists, National Native American Journalists Association. They all have their own websites with toolboxes that are, they're pretty regularly updating their style guides, which is helpful. And of course, word choice is one facet, but there are larger and more complex issues to deal with. And so for thinking about those things, one of my favorite resources is actually, it comes from sociology. It's from a group called Race Forward. And this was actually a huge part of the framework for my book, looking at individual level racism versus systemic level racism and systemic awareness in news coverage. And so I know the Alumni Association is going to be sending out a follow-up email to all of you who have joined us. Thank you for joining us today. And I'll provide them with those links so that everyone can have access to those.
Wonderful. I really appreciate, Carolyn, your consistent underlining of humility in the face of all the complexities faced by journalists. And it's really refreshing in this time we're living in right now. Our next question asks, what specific news sources would you recommend in order to hear anti-racist perspectives? Could you put links into the chat?
Sure. I can't put links into the chat, but I can recommend a couple. And what I really want to say is when we read Ibram X. Kendi, what he tells us is there's really two choices. You can be racist or anti-racist. So when we're talking about anti-racist journalism, I'll go back and say that's journalism at its best. Journalism, how it's supposed to function, representing the diversity and complexity of society, representing systemic awareness in coverage. And so what I think it's really important for us to do, all of us, is to be just really more conscientious consumers. And, you know, I did this in the form of an academic study, but anybody can do this reading a news article. So I'll tell you briefly what I looked at. When I was analyzing coverage, and a lot of this is based in critical race theory, but when I was analyzing coverage, I was looking at who are the sources. Do we know the races of the sources? Are they elites in power? Are they people speaking their own truth, right? Are they speaking about their own lived experience? I looked at what's the narrative of the conflict. How is this story explaining to the reader who's responsible, who's important, who's at fault, and also who's left out of this story, right? That's important to think about too. And sometimes since they're not there, it's a lot less obvious, but it's really important to think who's missing from this picture. And then the third thing I looked at in analyzing coverage was this systemic awareness of racism, because what we saw in the very beginning of the coverage of Ferguson was, oh my gosh, look at this thing that happened in Ferguson. It's such an anomaly. And of course it was not. And then we saw coverage that was like, wow, what is this place, Ferguson? What a messed up place. It's really terrible. And then we really started to see Ferguson is all over the place. Ferguson is in every state. Ferguson is in most cities, right? So when we can acknowledge that systemic awareness in coverage, that's good coverage. And so you might find that kind of coverage in the Washington Post and the New York Times. You might find it, you're more likely to find it in BuzzFeed. You're more likely to find it in The Root. You're more likely to find it in The Atlantic. some longer form pieces that really contextualize things. But rather than trying to focus on where we find it, I think it's also important to just take apart everything we read and say, is it here? Is it in this piece? Is it in this piece? Because remember, if it's not anti-racist, it's racist.
Thank you. And for everyone out there, we'll include links in the thank you email that we'll send you for having registered for and this webinar in appreciation. And so there will be some web links coming out to you. We have a live question said from a state of curiosity. It begins with the word curious, and it references style guides that I'm not aware of, but it's not my field. He asks, curious about your thoughts on style guides that promote capitalizing Black, but not white. Is that appropriate?
Yes. This is a very controversial issue, and that is my personal opinion. Over the summer, so style guides really govern how news organizations should write things. And I will tell you that the same thing I tell my students, which is, you know, just like the dictionary or the encyclopedia or any of these references we use, the folks who create style guides are largely white men. And so for many, many, many years, the style book, the Associated Press style book, which is the one that we mostly use, just ignored really important issues about people with disabilities were not addressed for a very long time, about people's, how to write about immigration status wasn't addressed until just, you know, a few years ago when journalists came forward and said, please stop using the I word, illegal, right? And over the summer, folks began having a debate about whether we should capitalize Black. And it was surprising to me the amount of pushback in this debate. We capitalize Native American. We capitalize Latino, Latina, and Latinx, right? And so the thinking and justification there is that Black identity is on par with Native American or Latinx or Asian American identity, and that white is not. I can tell you, even within my book, which was only recently published, there were, I was not allowed to capitalize Black. So this is a pretty recent change, and I agree with those who have justified it as an identity that merits capitalization.
Thank you so much for shedding light on that. We have another live question that comes out of right out of your talk. What are considered elite sources? How can stories include experts without this status?
Right, that's a great question. So elite sources, of course, if you're writing a crime story, you probably need to talk to the police chief about the protest, right? Of course. But whether or not that person drives the story, and that's what we see a lot, right? I can remember even here locally after the 2016 election, a headline that said, police say that incidents of racial harassment are not up in Bellingham. And the only person quoted in that story, only folks quoted in that story were police, right? That's problematic. And white folks, right? So yes, we do need to have folks in our story, but they shouldn't dominate the story, which has been the case for, I mean, the early studies on this go back to Lance Bennett's work in the 1980s, right? And they're still kind of happening. So what I try, and several professors in my department, what we try to teach in our journalism classes is that every story should have sources who live the issue, who are responsible for the issue, and who study the issue, right? And so people who study the issue, usually they're folks like me or you know, they're professors, right? We have this 10,000 foot view. We can look at things theoretically. People who are responsible for the issue tend to be more like elites, what I would talk about in terms of elites. Elected folks, people in positions of power whose job it is to be responsible for a problem. And then of course, folks who live the issue are people who experience things. Too often we see that news coverage features elites talking about others, right? So there was a study about how people who are living on food assistance are never sources in the story. It's economists talking about people who are using welfare, right? But we never talk to the people who are actually trying to feed their families this way. And so it's not that we shouldn't have elites, it's that we shouldn't let them dominate the coverage, which has always been the case.
Thank you. We'll go back to one of the previously submitted questions. Where is the divide between mainstream media and alternative news? How is the accountability for truth in journalism addressed? Are we back into the age of Hearst and the yellow or even red journalism?
That's a lot to unpack. So I will say, first of all, that I am not an expert in alternative journalism. If you want to read someone who is, I would definitely recommend that you read Chris Atten, who wrote a book called Alternative Journalism. I've read his book, and it's really excellent. Because I'm not an expert in this, I'm going to be a little bit hesitant. I really sort of see these lines blurring. I mean, for example, in 2012, we saw that The Stranger, which calls itself an alternative weekly, won a Pulitzer Prize, which is, usually what we think of in terms of mainstream news media. And these new born digital outlets that I'm looking at, they don't seem to fit into this kind of binary category. So I think that's an interesting question. In terms of yellow journalism, I personally don't believe that the news media is trying to deceive us to sell papers, which is what yellow journalism is. And the term red journalism, I'm familiar with in the way that it's about bribing news outlets to cover you in a certain way. You might be able to prove me wrong, but that is not something that I see going on. In terms of accountability in journalism, that's the part of this question I want to really respond to, because that's where we see places like Black Twitter and the audience being able to gather around hashtags and create these forced conversations, right? Hashtag Ferguson was the most used hashtag in the first decade of Twitter, right? And Ferguson came to mean not just Ferguson, right? When these police killings happened, killings and encounters with police happened in other places around the country, they were still called hashtag Ferguson, right, on Twitter, to gather a community around this issue. And that called on journalists to be accountable for covering these things in ways that they had not for 25 years, right, to really see this systemic bias. So I personally am not longing for the old days, as you can probably tell. I don't think there was some previous golden era, nor do I think journalism is in its glory days now. But what I do think is we are heading toward a more just, a more democratic, and a more representative form of journalism, and that makes me really excited.
That seems like a wonderful way to wrap up today and your talk. And now we're going to invite the Dean back on to close us out.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Carolyn, for a wonderful session today. Thanks to all of you who are attending and who have participated, submitted really good questions that have provided a great framework for a conversation. I thank you all, and I invite you all to join us in our next webinar, which will happen a little bit before the election with the topic of the election. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a great afternoon.